I'm reading this morning from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians in chapter 3. Paul writes, "Does this sound as if we were again boasting about ourselves? Could it be that, like some other people, we need letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are the letter that we have, written in our hearts for everyone to know and read. It is clear that Christ himself wrote this letter and sent it by us. It is written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, and not on some tablets, but on human hearts." And we say this because we have confidence in God through Christ. There is nothing in us that allows us to claim that we are capable of doing this work. The capacity we have comes from God. It is He who made us capable of serving the new covenant, which consists not of a written law, but of the Spirit. The written law brings death, but the Spirit gives life. Several years ago, I was unfortunately the victim of a heart attack and a subsequent bypass operation carried out in the Royal Infirmary. And some months after that unwelcome experience, my son David, who was at that time 18, suffered heart failure. After a long spell in hospital in Glasgow, he was transferred to the Freeman Hospital in Newcastle. And there David was given a heart transplant, a new heart and a new beginning. Sadly, David died a number of years ago, not because his heart failed. Unfortunately, it was because his arteries were diseased. But needless to say, the heart has played a very dominant role in my family's life. Our hearts at the very center of all of our lives. And a healthy heart is an essential feature of our overall health and vitality. We often speak about the heart as being at the very center of things. The heart of the matter is a phrase that we often hear and expresses the importance of a particularly essential part of an argument or a point of view. In the Old Testament, in the book of Ezekiel, we find Ezekiel speaking about the heart in the context of faith. The people of Israel had fallen from grace. The people of Israel had neglected their God. They had drifted away from their traditional faith and they had turned to idolatry. Their morality was called into question. and the words of God himself had brought disgrace to his name. But God said that he would give them a new heart and a new spirit. He said, I will take away your stubborn heart of stone and give you a new heart of obedience, he said. Paul, in his letters, often refers to the heart as being the focus of faith. And he too speaks about stubborn hearts. He encourages us to open up our hearts to receive Christ into our lives. And the new covenant with Christ is not one that is written in stone like the covenant with Moses. It's a covenant established through Christ, and, says Paul, is written on our hearts. I discovered some years ago a book called The Magnet of the Heart. It was written by a Dr. Robert Mingus, whom I knew to be the retired minister of Camp Hill Queen's Park Church. And it was he who actually baptized me as a baby. In Robert Mingus's book, he focuses on the idea of Jesus being this magnet, this attracting power that is the essential strengthening quality that lies at the very center of the church. In this respect, it is the heart of the church. It is in this respect that Jesus is indeed the very life of the church. One of the favourite songs that the children in my church in Croftfoot sang on a regular basis was a song which is God's Not Dead, He is Alive. And it's a song that focuses on the theme of the resurrection of Jesus. And in its simple way, it conveys the message that we are not speaking or singing about a God who is dead, but a God who is very much alive. And one of the verses speaks about feeling it in our hearts. One of the serious problems that the church has to contend with is a need to persuade people that our church is still relevant today. That our church is not just a symbol of some past glory, an institution which reflects something about our past history, but doesn't have very much to say about our modern world. But what we have to do in the church is convince people that God is alive, and also that his church is alive and well as we journey through this 21st century. The church is the custodian of the gospel message. And this is a message that is directed to all generations. It's a message that calls upon people to turn away from their human, selfish, earthly desires and to begin to think seriously about spiritual responsibility. I believe it's a message that lies at the very heart of the church. And Jesus is at the very heart of it. The problem, of course, is that our human instincts and desires have such a strong hold on us that we find it very difficult to override them. And because of that difficulty, there is a natural tendency for us to relegate the gospel message with an excuse that it's irrelevant, that it doesn't have any importance in our modern technical society. But the irony is that generation after generation of people have used that very same excuse. The fact is that we are in constant danger of being spiritually dead, or at least spiritually unaware. And so we fail to see the relevance of the church. As far as we are concerned, God is dead, and so is his church. And so we are left with the task of changing people's minds. We are left with the task of establishing a new understanding of the gospel message. Each generation has experienced the same treatment, and even in the very earliest years of the church, we find leaders of the church doing all that they can to persuade people that the gospel message of Jesus Christ is relevant. Paul has left us with a number of letters which show us that people then are no different from the people of today. Paul had to repeatedly tell people about the relevance of the gospel and the struggle that they would have with their own human feelings. In his letter to the church in Galatia, we find Paul speaking to the people of the church about the battle that goes on inside each person. And he urges the people of Galatia to let their lives be controlled by God's Spirit and not their human desires. And he points out that the human feelings that people have lead to selfishness, to greed, to immorality, to jealousy and anger, over ambition. But people who let their humanity take hold are also liable to suffer from the temptations of our society. And so they drift further and further away from God. The difference in those who have turned towards God is very apparent because, says Paul the Great, the Spirit produces quite different feelings in people: love, joy, faithfulness, humility, self-control. And it's these qualities, if we are truthful to ourselves, that lead us to a far more meaningful and valuable lifestyle. And they help us recognize also the significance of the message of Jesus Christ as far as the world is concerned. And not only do they lead us to a more worthy personal lifestyle, they also lead us to a realization that God is in his heaven and all is well with the world. And not only that, but his church and the message that we have been entrusted with is a message that is important and valuable for the future well-being of our society and indeed our world. At the very least, we have to recognize that the church is a watchdog for our society. That the church is there to draw attention to the worst excesses of our human weakness and failure. The problems of drugs, the growth in crime, the breakdown in marriages, the deterioration in the moral fibre of our country, the drift away from the values of care in the community in relation to the poor, to the sick and the elderly, and the neglected in our society. And so the truth is that God is not dead, nor is his church. He is alive, and so is his church. Because we have a heart which has been enlivened and enriched by the coming of Jesus Christ.